GFCI, lots of GFCI rules. Let's focus on 210.8a, dealing with dwelling units. Let's go with the first one. Number 1, bathrooms. All 15 and 20 ampere 125 volt receptacles installed in bathrooms must be GFCI protected. And Article 100, which we covered in the first DVD, explains what a bathroom is. So those receptacles have to be GFCI. Garages in dwelling units. All 15 and 20 ampere 125 volt receptacles installed in a dwelling unit garage must be GFCI. That includes receptacles behind appliances. That would include receptacles, let's say, up in the ceiling for the garage door, receptacles that are dedicated for equipment. Any 15 or 20 ampere 125 volt receptacle in a dwelling unit garage or accessory building, and that's also garages and accessory buildings, must be GFCI protected. And there's your accessory building rule. So we're okay. We have a slide for that. And outdoor receptacles of dwelling units. All outside receptacles that are 15 and 20 ampere, 125 volt, must be GFCI protected. That would include the receptacles up over the overhang on that receptacle there. There's an exception for receptacles outdoors for snow melting equipment. Ryan, Utah area, you guys have snow melting equipment that you place on the roof?
Sure.
Does it? When you get a chance, give me a photo of that.
Yeah, sure.
Send it to me.
Well, you know what's so funny about this rule, and this is a little game we play with the electricians as inspectors. You go to do a final, and what will happen is you look at the panel, and it'll say Christmas lights on the panel schedule. You know, see right now, okay, provide GFCI protection for Christmas lights, C 210.8A3. You come back, and Christmas lights has been scribbled out, and it says heat tape. And you're like, oh, it magically turned into heat tape now. But then, because what will happen is an electrician will read this exception and say, okay, well, there's an exception for heat tape. And this is just a great example of, don't just read part of the exception. The exception says C426.28. So then 426.28 says, listen, you got to have GFPE protection.
Let's pop up here. So you need GFCI protection for outdoor receptacles.
Right.
For dwelling unit. Exception, receptacles that are not readily accessible, that would be elevated, right? Requiring portable ladder to get to it. Article 100, right? That's that language, Doug, we talked about that. We need to go to 100, understand that. And are supplied by a dedicated branch circuit. So now, these receptacles are a dedicated branch circuit for electric snow melting or de-ice equipment shall be permitted to be installed in accordance with 426.28.
Right.
So these receptacles do not have to be GFCI protected as long as it's a dedicated circuit installed in 426.28. And what does 426.28 tell us?
426.28 says you have to have ground fault protection of equipment. So you have to have GFPE protection, either on the equipment or at the device. So you do the inspection, you know, said Christmas lights, you come back, it's scribbled out, it says heat tape. So then you're right, okay, provide GFPE protection.
So now you're violating 426.28.
And then you come back. Yeah.
Now, you got to understand theory, because when I say things, I'm assuming you understand some fundamentals. Ground fault protection is the type of protection device that looks for a ground fault of 30 milliamperes or less, where GFCI, ground fault circuit interrupters, are looking for 5 milliamperes plus or minus. It will trip 6 or more, but it will not trip less than 4. So ground fault protection, ground fault circuit interrupters, GFCI is 5 milliamperes. Ground fault protection of equipment, because it's not protecting people, it's protecting equipment, it's set at a maximum of 30 milliamperes. And when you have snow melting equipment and you got it on the roof, if there happened to be a ground fault of that heating cable, you could have a low-level arcing fault that could cause a fire on the roof. So therefore, we need to have ground fault protection of the equipment. Now, can you get a regular 125-volt ground fault protection of equipment circuit breaker?
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like a GFCI, except it's for ground fault protection equipment.
And it costs about 3 times as much. You know, is that right, Kevin?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Kevin.
Yes, and Ryan stated, and it needs to be emphasized, that the 426.28 requirement is for protection of the heat tape. It can be downstream of the receptacle. It does not have to be for the entire branch circuit. Secondly, some of the arc fault circuit interrupters include a 30 milliamp GFI protective component, but those circuit breakers have not been evaluated for 426.28 purposes.
Yeah, but if they're listed as a ground fault protector, and I believe Cutler Hammer's AFCIs are listed as ground fault protectors, then you could put an AFCI protected circuit that pick up those outside receptacles, then we'd be okay. All right, let's go back to this graphic. I realize a lot of you guys don't have snow melted equipment, and for those of you guys like, this is a bunch of baloney. Well, some people do, and so this is important to them. Let's review it. Outside receptacles are required to be GFCI protected to 15 or 20 ampere, 125 volts. If you have receptacles that comply with 426.28, and if it's a dedicated circuit for those receptacles and it complies with the ground fault protection requirements, then that receptacle doesn't have to be GFCI. You know what? It's just a lot easier to put GFCI protection for that receptacle than it is to screw around with all this other stuff. So that's my advice. And you have to provide better protection. Let's move on to the next rule. 210.8A5, having to do with basements, dwelling units, 15, 20 ampere, 125 volt receptacles in unfinished areas. Basements must be GFCI. That includes all of them. The receptacles that's behind here. Matter of fact, this receptacle for the washing machine would have to be GFCI. Is that right? That receptacle that's convenient. Any receptacles that's an unfinished basement would have to be GFCI. Right?
Yeah, just really quickly, on the unfinished basement thing, I get a lot of questions asked, well, what's an unfinished basement? And if you look at the code in 210.8A5, it gives you a definition for the purposes of that rule. And it's not a function of, is it painted, or does it have, does it have a floor covering, does it have carpet? It's all a function of intended use. Are you using it as a storage area, a work area, and similar applications? If you are, it's unfinished. I don't care that it's painted and has carpet. That's still considered to be an unfinished basement for the purposes of this rule.
What's that? Unfinished basements are defined as portions or areas of basement not intended as habitable rooms and limited to storage areas, work areas, and the like. So this is kind of like you just said, it's kind of like a definition of what an unfinished basement is.
But it doesn't matter that you've got bare concrete or if you have carpet. That's not relevant. It's all a matter of intended use.
Got it. Thank you very much. 210.8A6, kitchen receptacles. All 15, 20 ampere, 125 volt receptacles that serve dwelling unit kitchen countertop surfaces must be GFCI. So these receptacles, and the code gives us specific requirements and when you have to have receptacles for the countertop surface. And those receptacles have to be GFCI. That would be your countertop surfaces, your islands, your peninsulas. But let's say refrigerator receptacle or an appliance receptacle, convenient receptacle on the wall, those are not required to be GFCI protected. Wet bars. GFCI protection required if the receptacle, 15, 20 ampere, 125 volt, is within 6 feet of a wet bar. Okay, a laundry sink, a utility sink, or a wet bar. We happen to be showing here just a wet bar sink. Here is your laundry. If you have a laundry and you have a receptacle within 6 feet, that's 15 or 20 ampere, 125 volt, that receptacle has to be, that's GFCI, and that would be GFCI because it's within 6 feet. Maybe the thing is to rearrange, now that receptacle doesn't have to be, and here's a gas dryer, this receptacle doesn't have to be. And the question comes up is, well, what about receptacles that are within 6 feet that are not within that room? I'm not even going to go there. Not sure what that rule is. This happens to be at my house, and there's a receptacle, I guess, plugged in right there, and that's within 6 feet. That has to be GFCI. Steve?
As we end up the dwelling units, we mentioned that in garages, those exceptions are no longer there for the readily accessible and for the dedicated appliance, but we didn't mention that that's also true on the basements. We used to have those exceptions there, and they are no longer there.
Let me go back for those that I didn't mention this, but let's go back to the garage. There were exceptions to the 2005 code that said that receptacles that are not readily accessible did not have to be GFCI, and receptacles that were dedicated for a specific appliance did not have to be GFCI. Those were deleted, which means now all those receptacles in garages. And same thing happens to accessory buildings for dwelling units.